Está bien, gracias. No, estamos esperando 5 minutos. ¿Ya? No, creo que está bien.
केयर इसमें करे छे लेकिन कम करे छे
And Nishant, you can start.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, because of time.
Good evening to everyone who has joined. Although we have some more participants who will be joining shortly, we'll begin because it's already 5:30. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Global Ethnobotany Research Webinar Series, guest lecture number 6. The topic for today is Ethnobotanical Studies and Publication in a World of Nagoya Protocol and Post-SARS COVID-19. Today we have a very special guest lecturer and a pioneer in the field of ethnobotany, Dr. Rainer Busman. It's an honor and we are very pleased to have him with us today, and we'd like to begin by thanking him for accepting our request. I now request, because all of you must be aware that this talk is organized by the Center for Conservation of Natural Resources, the University of Transdisciplinary Health Sciences and Technology. So to begin with, let us have a small introduction to what our university is about, and then we can proceed further. I kindly request Dr. Abdul Karim, our center head, to give an introduction about the university. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishant. I welcome on behalf of the university to Dr. Rainer V. Busman, who is an ethnobotanist and a vegetation ecologist, and also a taxonomist by profession. And before I could introduce him in detail, I'll just say a few words about the TDU. The University of Transdisciplinary Health Sciences was conceived initially as a FRLHT, as a Foundation for Revitalization of Local Health Tradition Trust, founded by in 1993 by two famous icons, Sri Sam Pitroda and Darshan Shankar. It evolved out of 27 years of pioneering work of the trust, the foundation, and in 2014 they registered us as a state university. And this university is the research has a research mission to interface between Indian knowledge system and modern science. Yeah, next slide, Rajan. Yeah, so I'll just not take much of your time. I'll just show one slide which gives the achievements of what we have done till 21. This started with one of the major achievement with this university has done is facilitated in establishing the medicinal plant conservation areas across the 13 states of the country, which is one of the largest conservation program, which is of the tropical world. And this university also has a computerized database of and herbariums of medicinal plants of India, which is more than 6,000 and odd species which have been used by the different folk healers of the country and different system of medicines like Ayurveda, Siddha, Sorikpa, Unani, and homeopathy. And this is one of the largest database which has the entire information on its distribution, to its local names, to its utilization, to its pharmacopoeia. Then we also have a lab which tries to work with, shows bridging the gap between linking with Shastra and science. A lot of research has been carried out in this lab. And now the first national Ayush policy of local health tradition has been put into the planning commission, where we had a lot of negotiations towards it. And then we also have a grassroots folk healers association started in the different states. And we also tried to get the manuscripts from different all over the country and try to catalog this. We work with the government of Karnataka, who has given us a project on trying to see that piece from Karnataka, whatever the manuscripts are available, we are trying to catalog it, translate it, and see that it has been available for public use. And also establishing a herbal garden across the India and different states, so that it can take care of the primary healthcare needs of the community or the women in the village level. And one of the good important thing also we have seen is that we have tried to document the ethno-veterinary practices of in the country, and for 5 to 6 major diseases we have tried to see that this has been used and very good successful rate. So we work with NDDB and the local Amul and other companies veterinarians, and see that this formulation has been used instead of the antibiotics which have been given to the animals, and in also contribute to the National Ayush 5-year plan, which was there, and different things have been included as a part of the plan, and then established an 100-bed Ayurvedic research hospital, which is of a unique nature, which sees that how really the Ayurvedic, the traditional knowledge and the modern knowledge has been bridging together on the case of health as concerned. And in 13, we established the Transdisciplinary Health Sciences and University, which we run a lot of courses, and established a holistic nutrition research lab, through which the traditional foods that we eat have been documented and seen that this has been entered into the mainstream so-called hotel management and hotel other things. Instead of giving it in the form of a different form, can the traditional food products can be taken into and it's been revitalized and given back to in the hotels or in the, and not even that, also for the hospitals, where instead of giving the general food, can we give the traditional food which we have followed it. So separate lab is that we are working towards it. So these are some of the major achievements I thought I will explain about what TDU. And now I would like to also introduce our guest, who has today who has agreed to come with his busy schedule. As I mentioned, he's a professor. But if you see his, just Google his name and see exactly his work that he has done. Oh, it's tremendous. So he's a professor of ethnobotany in the College of Arts and Science at Tulsi in Georgia. He's also co-director of an NGO called Savings Knowledge, and he's from a farmer's background. If you see his family, if you see his history, I just read it. He's from a farmer's background, and his publications are more than 2,952, and his citations are 22,445 citations. Jada, if you could see his citations, and his grant support. If you could look the grant that he has got in the entire process, it's a huge. Every year you can see the number of grants that he has got. People just like that don't give a grant as such. If you have knowledge, ideas, new innovations, only grants have been got, because we know what exactly how difficult it is to get the grant. But if you see his history, it's really very interesting, and we are really privileged to have him with us today. And if you see the committee members, he's in a series of advisory committee members. You could see starting from postdoctoral to masters and many research programs, and number of researchers he has guided on a PhD and MS masters. And also his work is not in desk again, completely field work. If you see his work, all publications are mostly on the field work which he has done, of very, very enormous field work which has been done. And he has his own blog. I feel that you look on his blog on his activities that he has given, and very good advices he has given for the young ethnobotanists, how they should really do it. And then he's saying that his first critic paper that he has done was the forest restriction and especially for and management in Kenya, which excited him to go through this entire career. He has mentioned in his history biography. I think this is something which we are really excited, and we are really happy that he has agreed to spend time with us and help our young ethnobotanists, and also our other ethnobotanists of the country and all over the world. And we are expecting very eagerly to hear about his advices, his findings, his research to us. Thank you, Dr. Rainer, to give your time. Now I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdul Karim, for giving that brief introduction. We are certainly very excited, but for a smooth webinar, we request all the participants to please be on mute so that we can hear the speaker only. And now I request Dr. Rainer to share his screen.
Here we are.
Yes, we can see your screen. Yes, please. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Professor Karim, for this very nice introduction. It's a great pleasure to give this talk and to see so many names on the screen of people I know and I have interacted with. So this is a great pleasure. Of course, congratulations to all the achievements. There is lots that has been done in ethnobotany in India. In fact, India is one of the most advanced countries when it comes to ethnobotanical research. And for that reason, it's great to talk about ethnobotanical studies and publications in the 21st century, which essentially is a world of Nagoya Protocol and now SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And I will give a little bit of an introduction of how we got there and show you a nice example of how studies in this world can work well. And then we'll also talk a little bit about publications. So here we go. Yes, Dr. Karim pointed out, I started out working in Africa as a vegetation ecologist. This is Mount Kenya, this is my mountain. And my job was to do a nice vegetation map, which was very interesting. And at the end, however, not very useful, because when we finished mapping all the vegetation units, most of the forest had been cut down because, of course, people tend to use forests. But as an ecologist at that point, I had not much interest in people, but this is how the area looked like, agriculture, burning, and so on. People have to live. And initially, we published a very pointed work on destruction and management, and basically said, we need nurseries, that's of course important, but we should get all squatters out of the forest, and we need an education program about the ecological role of forests. And this, of course, completely ignored that all the people there had been in the forest much before we started to do work there. So typical ignorance of an ecologist at that point. And if you look at publications at that point, I mean, they reported on forest vegetation, always with one author, meaning myself. But we did a little bit of ethnobotanical work by accident. Some of our forest guards talked about plant use. So we said, well, let's register that. Maybe it's useful for something. But at the end, this got us to the Nagoya Protocol, because we became aware that, of course, people have been using these forests for a long time, and that they actually needed to be included in research and decision making. And you certainly have heard that the Nagoya Protocol asks for fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. And I'll get very quickly into what does that mean. Of course, benefit sharing means sharing of all benefits that might come out, for example, of research work. It means access to those resources and appropriate transfer of technologies. There needs to be funding for conservation and sustainable use. And most importantly, from an ethnobotanical perspective, of course, our colleagues, and that means our local native colleagues, need to give prior and informed consent before we work. And of course, work can only go on after an agreement has been established. And from our perspective, this benefit sharing must not only include repatriation of new data, our research data essentially, in a language and form that traditional owners understand and want, but it should also mean translation and repatriation of previous studies in those communities that have not been returned yet. And of course, we believe that our counterparts should be allowed full participation, and that also means participation as authors in publications, if they so want. And this is something we don't like. For example, here global plants of JSTOR, the database of scanned type specimens. And the plant in question here is one I collected and described, but if I'm sitting in my home, I can't access my own type. I don't have permission. And this is something that really riles us. This is not how modern research and databasing should happen. So now I will talk a little bit about an example that we did with an indigenous community in Bolivia that shows how we actually can comply with the Nagoya Protocol and involve local participants on all levels and make something scientifically interesting out of it. Because even though it was not a requirement at that time, we already started publishing together with local counterparts in the early 2000s. So this is way before the Nagoya Protocol. And in 2014, we started a large pilot project that wanted to show how the Nagoya Protocol could be implemented well and how traditional communities could participate. So this is the Chocobo Ethnobotanical Project here with its Spanish name. And all the people you see on this are locals. You would say that they're native tribal members. They're actually all teachers. They all speak their local language and also Spanish as national language. So we decided to see whether we could train these guys as interviewers and plant collectors, which makes a lot of sense because they're always there. They have lots of time for interviews. There is no problem with logistics. It's a very effective and cheap way to gather data. This is what we wanted to show. And of course, it complies with all stipulations of the Nagoya Protocol. So who are the Chocobo? They live here in the very north of Bolivia, here South America, so up there. Small community, there are only 1,000 members, about 350 adults. They used to be nomadic. Since the 1960s, they have been settled by first missionaries. Now they have their complete territory back, which is about 450,000 hectares. The interesting thing is there were lots of visits to them since 1910, 11. Anthropologists, then there were some ethnobotanical studies. So we had a lot of material to compare to. And one question we asked is, what about maintenance of knowledge? Because all of us hear about knowledge being lost, knowledge disappearing, the need that we have to document it very quickly. And we wanted to know whether this is actually always the case, because especially many of those ethnobotanical studies indicated that, yes, knowledge was disappearing there. So obviously life has changed. This is how people looked in the 1950s. This what happened in the 1980s, and this is how people look nowadays. So change in clothing, of course. And we believe that, well, probably this also causes a knowledge loss. So what did we do? We trained 12 tribal people as ethnobotanists. They almost did interviews with almost all the adults. I said there are 350, so they interviewed 301. So it's basically one tribe that has completely been interviewed. They collected lots of good vouchers. So very, very interesting. And of course, the first question we asked, we wanted to analyze this scientifically. So we said, which factors do influence knowledge there? Because there are, of course, many factors. Well, first of all, we saw that knowledge there was very equally distributed. If you look at our numbers of participants, they are very equal across genders, across age classes. And it is very interesting to see that people know generally the same. We have a large informant consensus, meaning everybody knows of everything. And this was the first interesting finding, because normally we think knowledge is unequally distributed, not in this case. And we saw that informant consensus, both when it came to plant species and to uses, was essentially influenced by where people were living, which community they were in. That makes perfect sense, because some communities are located in primary forests, some are in savanna. So the surroundings play the most important role in what people know or don't know. Other factors, age, gender, ethnicity, were not particularly important. Well, we did see that older participants knew more than younger ones. So here, the young ones, they always knew a little less. The older ones always knew a little more. However, there was an interesting discrepancy, because people in the 51 to 60 age group knew least. which is very astonishing because these are almost elders. And the explanation was the influence of Christian missionaries, because the missionaries prohibited local plant use exactly when these people were children. So they learned less, but it's also a very good indication that after that influence stopped, people started recovering their knowledge, which is why all these youngsters now know more than their parents in all categories, really. But then we also asked, what about all these different indices that we see in ethnobotanical papers? Because every paper reports most of the time 1 or 2 indices and claims that they give all the information. So we asked, is that really true? So if you look at the different species names, always the bold ones are palms because they're very important for the community. But when it comes to use value, you see that this species is the most valuable one for the community. So if you base your work on this index only, you would say this is the most important one for conservation. It happens to be a pioneer species, so maybe that's not exactly the case. But then if you look at diversity of uses, it looks completely different. You see that the species composition is a different one, and Cedrela officialis in this case is the plant that has the highest diversity of uses. So maybe that one is the most important one for conservation purposes. Or if we look at cultural importance, then you might see that a piper species was extremely important for some individuals, but a palm was the most important plant for the whole community. So looking at those 4 indices already shows that no one of them can give us the complete information. And if we really want to use a statistical analysis and its results to, for example, work in conservation and sustainable development, we better look at a variety of indices to really get the whole picture. But then we ask, well, who should really do ethnobotanical studies? Can it be tribal members, or does it always have to be scientists? Well, first we asked, do interviewers influence the participants? And not surprising, the interviewer is always in the center. So all interviewers had participants' answers relatively close to their own knowledge. So yes, there was an influence of who the interviewers were. And was there a difference between different interviewers? And I see, yes, there were people who recorded lots of species, some recorded less, some recorded lots of uses, and some recorded few. And the interesting thing is the gray squares, this is us scientists, because we also did interviews. We wanted to know, do we get more data than the locals or not? And as you can see, the local interviewers were actually very close to what we scientists would have got. So we can say, yes, the local population, when trained, worked perfectly as interviewers. But then we asked, well, who does better interviews? People who know little or people who know a lot, both in species and uses. So the dark ones are the ones who knew little. The light blue ones are the ones who knew a lot. And we can actually see that interviewers who knew not so much got better interviews than some interviewers who themselves had very high plant knowledge. So some interviewers pull answers to their own knowledge. That is pretty much clear. But do these guys get information that is not included in their own knowledge set, or do they just repeat what they know themselves? And simple question is yes. No matter how much an interviewer knew, they all got at least between 30 and 60% additional new information from the participants. So very interesting. Knowledge of the interviewers didn't matter. But what did matter were interview methods. And one question we wanted to ask is, what is better? very detailed, standardized questionnaires or free list interviews? What does give us more information? The blue one you can see here was a focus study we did only on palms. And the red one is only data on palms that we added in the big free list study that the local interviewers did. So if you look at the number of informants, for the palm one, we had 87, which is already a lot because many ethnobotanical studies have maybe 20, 30, 40 participants. We decided to have more, but you can see that even with 87 participants, we did not get information on all species. We did not get information on all use categories. We did get most of the uses, and we got better information on part use, but you see that if we do free listing to get, for example, all information on species use, we needed all the participants, which means if you do free listing in ethnobotanical studies, you better make sure you have a lot of participants if you want to get all the information. And the categories of information we got were also different. The focus study reported especially on some important species and their uses, whereas the data on the free list study were much more scattered and, of course, added a lot of local personal information from people who participated. And by accident, we actually did repeat interviews, which means some people were interviewed a couple of times, and some people who had participated in the PALM study were interviewed again. So generally speaking, first, these guys were all interviewed at least twice, and you see that their answers sometimes greatly differed. So if you talk to somebody 2 times, you might get completely different responses, which is something to take into account. And we saw a similar variation when we looked only at Aricacea, at palms. This is the people who were interviewed for palms only. And here they participated in a general ethnobotanical study. And so even the people who had already answered questions on very specific topics around palms gave much less information when they were interviewed about general ethnobotany. So this is extremely important because it shows how much interviews can really differ. And that got us back to this question whether knowledge was in fact changing or getting lost. Because we had all these data from anthropologists, from botanists, and this is our data that the local interviewers got together. And as you can see, in essentially in all categories, the local interviewers got more information than anybody else. Question is, why? Well, first of all, the anthropologists stayed in the houses in the villages, so they got very limited information about, well, some food plants, some household uses and whatever, but they did not get information about the whole flora. For the whole flora, you really have to get out of the village. The botanists both worked in one single forest plot, which means they collected a lot of species that had no uses for local people. And for that reason thought, well, probably knowledge is getting lost because there is little information. And only if you looked at all species in this community, you got the whole ethnobotanical information. And if you look at how this looks like, the blue ring is our new study done by locals, and it includes everything the anthropologists had collected. It also includes everything the botanists had collected, minus very few species that only grew in one forest plot these guys were working in and happened to have no use. So was there a knowledge loss? a nice example are these burden baskets used by women. This is the basket in 1909. And this is the basket in 2013. So no change, same species, same making of a basket. And this is only one example of many that shows that actually there was no knowledge loss. Knowledge loss was just perceived because the investigators, let's say, asked the wrong questions. However, this gets us to repatriation of knowledge. Of course, we like to give knowledge back, which is highly important, because that, one, is what we have to do under the Nagoya Protocol, and two, it also helps to further strengthen and maintain local knowledge. So what did we do with the Chocobo? We first published a book on palm use, because this was our first study, and the authors were actually the community members. This is absolutely no problem, even if you do a scientific publication, because, well, we can do a publication, say, in Nature with 100 co-authors, so why not name community members also? It's not really a problem. And we acted as editors of this. And as I said, we also tried to repatriate information that was collected before. So we translated this work, which was originally Ethnobotany of the Chocobo. This was done by New York Botanical Garden in the 1980s, but it had never been given back in any language local people could understand. And then we decided to translate every single book, article, whatever, that was published in 100 years about this local community. Again, we acted as editors. So the tribe became their history and their plant use in the 20th century back. And this was actually very emotional, because when we gave them the book, the headman of the community started crying, because he found that he was this little boy here with his grandfather, and he had never seen this photo, which was taken by a German anthropologist in the 1950s. And based on the knowledge they themselves got in the ethnobotanical study, we published Ethnobotany of the Chocobo in the 21st century, which basically includes all the knowledge the tribal members themselves documented. And then we went one step further and decided to involve them in scientific publications. And as you can see down here, these names are the names of all the interviewers that we had trained. Even one publication got into Nature Plants, which was actually very hard, because we had some reviewers that actually asked us whether our counterparts could read and write, which is a very racist comment, of course, because they got all the data and then we analyzed it, but they participated in the whole study. So claiming that indigenous people could not participate in the publication was something that, of course, we greatly criticized. And this gets us a little bit into how should we publish, because that's one question I'm quite frequently asked, especially by students. And of course, one important part is to use the correct journal, because it's always nice to send something to Science or Nature, but if you're an ethnobotanist, it's extremely unlikely that they publish it. So this is a great waste of time. And I have seen students who first send a paper to Science, then to Nature, then to PNAS, and then after 2 years, they still had not published anything. So it is important to select the journal that actually goes into our field. However, it should be an index journal, so journal that is in Scopus, for example. But impact factors are not everything, because they're only based on all citations in a journal divided by all papers. So say if one paper is the most cited one, all the other papers might have few citations. They have the same impact factor, but it does not say anything about their real impact. And as an editor, what I write when I reject papers quite frequently is please read the author guidelines, because quite a few researchers, especially students, tend to leave these out and then come up with very nice modern whatever layouts, but they don't follow the journal guidelines, which means it's very likely that the paper is simply being rejected on appearance, on structure, because if a student does not even bother to read the guidelines for a journal, then the content is probably also not very good. Of course, make sure you make all necessary ethics declarations and so on, and use the correct reference structure, because simply pasting references from one paper into your manuscript without adjusting them to the journal is very easy, but it does stand out. And it's also something very simple for reviewers to look at. And again, if somebody who wants to publish does not even bother with the reference structure, then the content is probably also not particularly great. So every editor I know and every reviewer would first look at that, and then, well, maybe look at the content if it's worth it. And please don't be sad if your paper gets rejected or if revisions are asked for. This is just normal. I mean, even a lot of my publications go through a couple of revisions. This is just completely normal, and it is a good strategy to really respond to reviewer comments. I mean, send in a sheet that gives a detailed response, because these people look at it. They spend their time to give comments, so they have a right to get your response, and that helps to get your thing accepted. And send the journal a clean version, but also a track change version, because it costs a lot of time to find what changes have been made if there are no track changes. So if you send a change version, you make the life of the editors and reviewers much easier. And that, of course, improves the chance to actually get published. What you should absolutely not do is take a rejected paper without any change and send it to a different journal. I think the highest number of cases I saw the same paper in different journals was 4 or so. And our community is small. So if you send your paper to the first journal, it gets rejected, you send it to a second one, it is very, very likely that at least one of the reviewers has seen it already. And if you have not addressed any comments, these people, and that includes me, will be rather unhappy and will be very happy to reject your paper again, just saying, well, I saw this before, nothing has changed, it's not worth anything. So make sure that you make the necessary changes. Think about the Nagoya Protocol, because most journals ask for that. And based on this, you'll be pretty successful in getting your papers out and accepted. And do not shy away from writing book chapters, because this is great practice. It adds to your CV if they have a DOI, because then, of course, every chapter is an own publication. And most chapters that are in big publishing houses like Springer are also indexed in Scopus. So writing book chapters is actually a very successful way of improving your publication record. And do accept to review papers. We are all busy, of course, and we are all writing publications or whatever. But you have to take into account that some colleague who is also busy has to review your paper when you send it in. So as editor, if I get a response of somebody saying, I'm very busy, I can't review because I have to write my own paper, then I keep that name in mind. And if I see that paper as a reviewer, I'm very likely to decline to review that paper because, well, I'm busy also, right? So keep that in mind. Editors will remember your name when you review, and they also will remember your name if you decline. And again, declining is very frequently not a good strategy to, in the future, getting published. So all this gets us a little bit into a new landscape in ethnobotany. We do need to recognize, and that includes administrators, that repatriation of knowledge is an important part of every project and should be part of any thesis. And of course, granting agencies have to recognize that under international legislation, which the Nagoya Protocol is, they would be required to give funding to make such materials available for the local participants. And of course, journal editors and reviewers need to make it a standard to reject papers that do not comply with international regulations, which also means that local counterparts and colleagues need to be involved in research and publications at all levels. And ethnoscience as such does need to be more internationally inclusive, because although ethnobotany originally was a US-UK concept, the main ethnobotanical centers or economic botany centers nowadays are not in the US or in the UK. If we look at where most is published and most research is being done, then of course India stands out, Brazil, we in Georgia. The old centers in the official Anglo world, I say, are much less important nowadays. And one example of that is that none of the old leading institutions participate in a book project we're doing, which is Ethnobotany of Mountain Regions. And if you look at volume editors, you will see absolutely nobody who is located in the US or the UK. It's all local editors who do a fantastic job. And to go further with this, we are right now working in a interdisciplinary graduate program on ethnoscience at institutions outside the old Anglo sphere of influence. So you might stay tuned and hear something about that at some point. So with this, I will stop here so that we have time for a few questions. And well, I hope we see you in Georgia at some point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raina. Well, I must say that it was a wonderful presentation. It was so moving when you said that including the local communities in ethnobotanical research and the importance that you described through that picture of the local community. That is wonderful. I'll be taking questions from the participants. I request the participants to kindly type out the questions in the chat box. We can have a few questions directly from the participants as well. So you can raise your hands and I can allow you.
Yeah, Nishant, before that, I would like to also just point out that it was really very good for the ethnobotany research to start with. The basic guidelines has been very clearly mentioned what that needs to be done. I really appreciate the effort which has been put into it. And I think it will be very useful for all our people. Yeah, we can take the questions now.
Since this talk is also live on YouTube, I'm taking questions from there. So the first question is from Dr. Makhan Singh from India. He asks, what is the high impact factor, details of journals? Yeah, he's asking details of a journal which has high impact factor in the field of ethnobotany.
So very, very good question. Of course, the most ethnobotanical journals have an impact factor that stands right now between 1.5 and 3. So if you look at the classic journals, Journal of Ethnobiology and Ethnomedicine, Economic Botany, Journal of Ethnopharmacology, this is where the impact factor goes. There are a couple of other journals that maybe hover between 3 and 4, but for ethnobotanical work, simply in our discipline, if we want to get our message out and actually want to have our papers read, Impact factors will always say rank between, I would say, 0.5 and 3. And we have to take our national journals into account. Like the Indian Journal for Traditional Knowledge has an impact factor that sometimes goes over 1 and is widely read, easy available. And we really like to have real impact. So rather, I would always say, rather than writing maybe 1 paper and waiting for years to get it published in a high impact journal, why not write 5 papers on different topics in less impact journals? And at the end, you have the same impact, but you will be much more read.
Thank you. I hope it has answered the question. Moving on to the next question. This question is from Hardeep Singh, who is a PhD scholar in India, Uttarakhand. He asks, how can ethnobotanical research, how will ethnobotanical research be carried out in the future? Because mostly all over the world, researchers on this aspect has been done. What are the new dimensions in which this field can be explored? So that's his question. Thank you.
It's also a very, very good question. And I recently said that I am not very enthusiastic about ethnobotanical research on medicines because a lot of medicinal use is documented. Think Ayurveda. I mean, it's documented for thousands of years. And most studies, including our own, very frequently show very simplistic uses of very few plants, especially if we talk to lay people. Of course, Amshis know more, but still medicine is pretty well documented. What is not so well documented is uses, for example, for food. So I think ethnobotany in the future will very much concentrate on plants used for food, because we have to see that we have to make sure a much bigger, fast-growing population has to eat. We also need information about local food plants to combat climate change. So this is, I think, where we are going. I think this is also extremely important because it's the basis for human survival, and ethnobotanists can play a very big role in that.
Thank you, Dr. Rainer. The next question is from Dr. Radha Krishnan. Since you were talking about the Nagoya Protocol, he asks, how many are really benefited from the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol?
Well, I would first say, for the moment, it benefits mostly researchers because it helps us to get published. There are very few communities worldwide that have greatly benefited because studies like ours with this tribal population in Bolivia are still very rare. And a lot of effort is being needed to involve local communities better in what we're doing. And I think this is also very important from the perspective of protecting traditional knowledge and intellectual property, because once something is published, even in a small book that reports on tribal knowledge in local language, it's not patentable. So it protects the resource for local people and also for the country. And we have seen lots of problems there. So doing more with local people and publishing with them, I think, is very important from that perspective also.
Thank you. Can we take a few more questions? Because I can see that there are many questions. Dr. Rainer?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm here as long as you like.
Sure. Okay. So the next question is from Dr. Debabrata Das. He asks, ethnobotany and economic botany, can I add boundary between them in a holistic way? If correct, then non-ethnic people may include in this study, and he asks your opinion, sir.
I think this is a very important question. First of all, we have to define what is ethnic, because I always would say where I grow up, I'm ethnic. So I mean, I have a German passport, but I would say I am ethnic Swabian. So we are all somewhere ethnic. We all have a certain ethnicity. So I think it doesn't matter whether we study an official tribal group or we study a grandmother growing vegetables on a roof garden in Delhi. It is both important. It has both to do with ethnic knowledge in some way. And I also don't distinguish really between ethnobotany and economic botany, because if I grow something in my garden, it also gives me an economic benefit. So say I grow tomatoes on my balcony, then I don't have to buy them. This is an economic benefit. So it is economic botany. So I would not distinguish. I think it all goes in the same direction. It's a very artificial separation, which is also why I don't like the old name of the Society for Economic Botany, because I think the distinction is rather outdated.
Thank you. I hope that answers the question. The next question is from Dr. Ramesh Unyal. He asks you to please share your views on validation of traditional knowledge on healthcare and how it should be done and its usefulness.
This is a very complicated question. First of all, I would say validation depends, first of all, on making sure that local people actually use the species that has always been used. So this has a historic perspective, because we do see that while many youngsters might still know a local name, they might not be sure about what the correct species is. So this is how far validation needs to go. When it comes to validation of efficacy, it's a much more difficult question, because on the one hand, lots of traditional practices involve a lot of ceremonies, which as such could easily be interpreted as placebo effect, of course. And a lot of traditional plant use includes mixtures. So just looking at one species and its compounds will not give us the whole picture. And third, we also have to take into account that, of course, compound composition changes depending on where plants grow, which is why the scientifically same species might have different vernacular names and different applications depending on where it grows or when it is collected. So verification or validation is a very problematic one. It needs to start with the species. It needs to take into account the ceremonial, let's say, placebo effect. And it also needs to take into account that lots of plants are simply used to treat certain symptoms. So if we look at all the medicinal plants that are now used to treat COVID around the world, you have anti-inflammatories, you have analgesics, you have antitussives, but very few are antiviral. So this is something very important to take into account. We frequently don't treat, say, the bug with traditional medicine. We treat parts of the symptoms of a disease. But on the other hand, the final important thing is that the patient gets better, no matter how. So as long as there is an effect that helps people, that already seems to me a good validation.
Wonderful. I think that explains it pretty much. But we have the next question from Muhammad Abdul. Well, there's this, since you also spoke about involving local communities who are the traditional knowledge practitioners versus researchers who come there for knowledge. So there's a question about what is the use of mere documentation of traditional knowledge? Shouldn't the vision be about revitalizing traditional knowledge and making it practiced across the communities and across the world? So that's the question.
I would say absolutely. We need to involve the younger population also, which is exactly what we did in the Chocobo project. Talking to everybody. But one important problem we see in many regions is that youngsters are often not interested in this kind of old knowledge. And by coming as ethnobotanists, we are automatically changing that perception, because if a foreigner comes and wants to talk to the grandfather about some obscure plants, it might actually be interesting. We often see that then young people come and listen because the foreigners are there, and that already helps to get them interested and to make them aware of that knowledge. The other part is, of course, the publication of local materials, because if something comes back to the villages in printed form, especially, then or for youngsters in digital form, then they see that it has a certain importance, and that helps to disseminate that knowledge and give them the impression that they actually should learn something about it. So yeah, this is very important.
Thank you. The next question is a little towards, we've had Dr. Andrea Pironi speak in the series before, and he did talk about cross-cultural ethnobotanical studies and cross-border ethnobotanical studies. So the question is, how do you move ethnobotany in the context of cross-border ethnobotanical studies, and how would that be useful and provide a new dimension towards the field?
Yeah, very, very good one. We are even here in the Caucasus trying to look at ethnic communities across different states, because all the countries here have, for example, Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia have all Azeri communities and vice versa. So it's very interesting to see what happened to knowledge of those communities under different political settings and under different economic settings. And as Andrea's work has shown, in some areas, it does make a huge difference if you live in a country with a wealthy economy, or if a same ethnic group lives in a country where plant use is still very important, because otherwise you starve. So I think especially documenting knowledge of ethnic communities in underprivileged areas and then compare it to similar ethnic groups in, say, more wealthy areas is of huge importance. It's also important for the guys who live under better conditions, because it does help them to connect to their original culture. And this is something that has to be done very quickly, because it does tend to get lost. And I give you a good example for that. Some of my ancestors were migrant Swabians who ended up in Yugoslavia, close to Belgrade, in the 1700s, and then came back after the Second World War to Germany. And nobody ever did an ethnobotanical study on their knowledge until we tried to do that a couple of years ago. And the result was very sad, because there was no knowledge left whatsoever in Germany, in that ethnic group. And in their original place, everybody was dead. So there was nothing to document anymore. So this is why this area of study is extremely important.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in on our YouTube channel. Can I take 2 more?
Sure, whatever, how many you want, as long as you have time. I mean, I'm open for any.
Wonderful. We have another 5 minutes. So this question is from Dr. Santosh Kumar Jha. This question is a little towards our efforts also towards popularizing ethnobotany amongst youngsters. So he asks what efforts we may take to make ethnobotany popular at undergraduate courses and with youngsters. So someone who's very passionate about this subject wants to know, how do I get it across the youngsters and make sure they learn about this?
Yeah, I always, that's a very nice one. I always ask my students at the beginning of a course whether they practice ethnobotany, whether plants are important in their lives. And most of them initially say, oh no, this is not very interesting. I say, did you drink tea this morning? What is your cotton shirt made of? you came with a bus. What are the tires of the bus made of? So I try to make students aware that all of us practice in a way ethnobotany and plant use every day. And that normally gets quite a bit of attention. And of course, the question then always is, well, if I study that, and can I later live off it? I mean, can I make money when I'm an ethnobotanist? And I think I like the idea to calling ethnobotany the science of survival, because we all need plants in our life. And under the current global scenario, especially with climate change and population growth, I think ethnobotany is going to become more and more important. So I think it's very smart to study ethnobotany.
Wonderful. I think that might answer the question. The next question, probably we can take two more. Again, from Dr. K. Radhakrishnan, ethnobotany has a major role to play in this pandemic period, and he wants to know your view on that.
I think it's important to recognize that there are quite a few plants that can help to alleviate effects of a COVID infection. And we also have to recognize that at least in many places, people don't have money to buy Western style medicine. Example, when the pandemic started, I was in Bolivia and you could not even buy an aspirin because it was simply not available. So knowing about plants that have similar effects made a good difference, because we could use, for example, of course, you can use willow bark instead of aspirin. There are other anti-inflammatories you can take, chamomile, for example. Eucalyptus was used very widely. So ethnobotany as a guiding science for the use of plants to replace allopathic medicines if they are not available was very important, because we also could advise the government on how to produce guidelines for which plants to use and which not, because people, especially in the cities, did not know plants very well. So in this context, ethnobotany was tremendously important, and I think it can also be in the future, including giving information about what plants cannot do, especially in pandemics like this one. I have not seen any plant yet that would work as an efficient, quote unquote, SARS-CoV-2 killer. So antivirals that would work extremely well in killing the virus is something I haven't seen yet. And so we can also advise on what not to expect.
Wonderful. I think I can take the last question. The last question is, what is, well, since the entire globally, there's a lot of changes that are happening, and researchers across the field of ethnobotany are experiencing that local communities themselves are changing a lot. When you go to a tribal community now, they are no longer the ones that had the same attire. They don't have the same traditional house. They have modern facilities, and obviously they want modern equipments. So how do you look at change in tribal communities, and what are your suggestions on maintaining balance so that their knowledge, ethnobotanical knowledge, survives, and also the tradition is carried forward?
Well, first of all, I think there has always been change. Traditional knowledge and culture is never static. We showed in a study in South America that of plants that were documented in the 1700s, nowadays 60% are not used anymore because, say, people found better plants to use. They learned about different plant use. And of course, we have to take into account that we're in the digital world. So people, even in remote regions, learn about new plants when they listen to, well, starting with radio and TV and so on. So change always happens. And I think change is actually good because it shows that people are constantly learning about what plants can be used. So I rather think, rather than being sad about that change, we should try to document the new uses and help communities to ensure that those new uses are actually correct, because this is where validation really comes in. There's so much news being spread around the globe about use of certain plants, and nobody gives an opinion whether it actually makes sense. This is also then where codified practitioners, think Ayurveda or traditional Chinese medicine, come in to advise on how plants should actually be used. So from an ethnobotanical perspective, this change is tremendously interesting and gives us a very important role in making sure that traditional, and that means plant-based medicine, is actually safe to use.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just have an addition to this, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Where at TDU we have developed an assessment process with documenting the local, I mean the ethnic knowledge, and seeing the references, as you said rightly, from the classical text, and coming out with the formulations which are very safe, and that has been promoted towards the community. So this is called as a DA-LHT process, documentation assessment of local health traditions. So that has worked out well, and that's how we promote that into the villages on different training programs. Their own knowledge has been given to them with a certain sort of additions towards it to support the entire system in such a way that it can go into the healthcare system, so that it has all the documents clear for the healthcare system to take this forward, especially for primary healthcare needs. Yeah, I agree your point. Yeah,
I think this is most excellent, and I only would wish that more countries would do that, because India is really on the forefront of doing that kind of work, and it's lacking in many places.
True.
Okay, so I think since we have addressed the last question, I think I would like to conclude that it was a wonderful session from Dr. Rainer, right from talking about involving communities to the Nagoya Protocol. I'm sure that all the participants have been highly benefited from this, and I can see from the questions, and I can also, let me share with you that everybody is loving this lecture. They're putting down comments on YouTube that it was a wonderful lecture, and they would like to, on behalf of all the participants, I'd like to thank you again for agreeing to talk in this webinar series. So thank you so much, Dr. Rainer, for this talk. I now request all the participants to kindly switch on their video so that we can have a small group photo. That's the least we could do to socialize. I'm sure that there'll be a day where we can all meet, but this is all we can do for now. So requesting all the participants to switch on their video so that I can take a quick group picture.
Of course, from my side, thanks again for this invitation, and thanks to all the participants for tuning in. And of course, feel free to circulate this lecture if you like, and of course, feel free to contact me if you like. I mean, if I have enough time, I'll get back to you. I mean, I'm always very happy for collaborations.
Wonderful. Sure. I think I can share your email ID with the participants.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we can wait. Can everybody switch on their camera? I'll just quickly take a group picture. Okay. Just 2-3 more people. Okay, I'll take the picture, the count of 3. So 1, 2, and 3. And take some more. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session. I hope that you enjoyed this session. And like Dr. Rainer said, you can certainly get in touch with him through his email ID. I will email his email ID to you, all of you, so you can share if you have any. Thank you again, Dr. Rainer, for that wonderful session. And I have recorded the talk, and I will be sharing it with participants.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Send me the link if you like, and hope we can meet in person at some point, as you said.
Sure.
Yes, definitely.
Definitely.
I will
Thank
be yes, I will be sharing the YouTube recording with all the participants. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today, and please take care of yourselves during this pandemic. I wish that you have a wonderful evening ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.